I never thought desperation would drive me here, to a place locals whispered about with the kind of reverence they usually reserved for graveyards or cursed ground. But when rent was late and job prospects were thinner than the autumn air, I signed the contract anyway, the paper heavy in my hands and the ink still wet with someone else's warning. My name is Gray Anderson, and Hawthorn House was not supposed to be a home. It was a performance piece, a heritage site advertised as immersive, though the staff whispered about it like they were clergymen afraid to say the devil's name too loud. And from the moment Mrs. Vale pressed the laminated card into my palm with the 3 rules written in bold block letters, I knew I was stepping into something older than tourism, something that wanted obedience as much as it wanted flesh. The rules were simple but strange. Rule 1. When the bell rings after midnight, do not answer the front door. Rule 2. If a mirror shows you from behind, do not turn around. Rule 3. Before dawn, count the staff, and if the number is odd, lock every interior door and wait in the nursery. And though I laughed on the outside, something in her eyes told me those rules weren't part of any gimmick. The house loomed on the ridge like a shipwreck stranded on land, windows like dark sockets, ivy like veins clinging to stone. And when I first walked through its iron gates, the crunch of gravel beneath my boots sounded like bones being chewed. The foyer, lit by a single chandelier, smelled of dust and polish, but also faintly of iron, like someone had dragged a rusty blade across the tiles just before I arrived. And the shadows stretched too long, as if the house itself wanted to keep its distance from me. I tried to convince myself that this was just atmosphere, part of the job, that haunted houses lived or died on illusion. And yet the house seemed less like a stage and more like a predator that had learned how to dress itself up for tourists, waiting for someone foolish enough to step inside and forget how to get out. They gave me a brass keyring, old enough to look antique, a lantern with a flame that flickered against drafts that never seemed to come from anywhere visible, and a two-way radio that hissed in my hand as though it resented being turned on. And I remember thinking then that no salary could possibly be worth the sense of weight pressing down on me, the way the floorboards seemed to exhale when I shifted my stance, or how the staircase to the second floor loomed like a throat waiting to swallow. The first night, I was told my duty was to hold the foyer after the tours ended, a phrase that made me feel less like an employee and more like a soldier on some forgotten front line. And as I stood there rehearsing the rules in my head, staring at the bronze fist of the front door knocker, I thought about the way Mrs. Vale had said, "Count the staff," with such deliberate seriousness, as though forgetting to do so would cost me more than my job. I remember the way the air shifted when the last guest left, how the echoes didn't fade but seemed to multiply, as if the walls themselves wanted to keep company with voices that had already gone. And when I turned my lantern toward the music room, the mirror there caught me not quite right, bending the shape of my reflection so it looked like someone else was inside me, just waiting for me to step closer and give it room. I reminded myself of Rule 2 then, almost laughing at how quickly I clung to a laminated card, but the laughter died in my throat when I realized my reflection had raised its lantern higher than I had, as if the version of me inside the glass wasn't bound by my own actions. I backed away before instinct betrayed me and forced me to turn, and I thought then about how thin the line was between surviving the night and feeding it, how maybe those rules weren't instructions at all, but offerings, ways of letting the house know who was in charge. In those moments, before midnight, before the bell, before the real testing began, I felt something shift inside me. The kind of dread that takes root in your bones and won't be shaken. The kind that reminds you you've stepped into a place where the ordinary world can't protect you. And as the clock chewed its way toward 12, every second gnawed on my nerves until I realized I wasn't waiting for ghosts or tricks or tourists anymore. I was waiting to see if I was strong enough to follow rules I didn't believe in, inside a house that seemed determined to find out what I'd do if I broke them. The first time the bell tolled after midnight, it wasn't from the grandfather clock in the parlor or the chapel bell the tourists posed with for photos. It was from somewhere deep in the house, a note so low and resonant it rattled the glass in the foyer windows and seemed to vibrate in my teeth. And when the second toll followed, the bronze fist on the front door raised itself as if invisible fingers guided it and struck 3 measured knocks that echoed through the marble floor straight into my chest. I froze, remembering Rule 1 with sudden clarity, because there's a difference between reading words on a card and living through the moment when they're the only thing keeping you from disaster. And though every instinct in me screamed to answer, to see who or what could be on the other side, I clenched my fists and backed away, whispering to myself not to touch the handle, not to break the rule, not to ruin my first night before I'd even begun. The whisper that slipped through the keyhole made my blood run cold. It was my name, spoken clearly, gently, almost with familiarity. The syllables stretched like they'd been practiced, and the sound was wrong. Not muffled by the wood, not distorted by distance, but right there in my ear as though someone crouched behind me and spoke into the hollow of my skull. And I swear for a moment I felt the heat of breath along the back of my neck, but when I spun around there was nothing. Just shadows draped heavy across the staircase and the lantern sputtering like it wanted to die. I forced myself to look away from the door, telling myself it was a trick of acoustics or a prank from the other staff, though the foyer was too still for jokes. And when the radio hissed in my hand, I nearly dropped it, the static popping and then forming into something almost like laughter, before cutting out entirely, leaving me stranded in silence so complete I could hear my pulse rushing in my ears. I thought about calling for Mrs. Vale or Lionel or the girls dressed as Victorian orphans, but the rules forbade it. Rule 1 didn't say unless you're scared or unless you think you're clever. It said do not answer. And so part of me knew that speaking out loud to anyone but myself might count as answering. And so I gritted my teeth, shoved the radio back into its clip, and stared hard at the chandelier swaying with a rhythm that didn't belong to any draft. The door knocker lowered itself at last, slow, deliberate, like a predator retreating to the tall grass, and the foyer exhaled, the tension bleeding away just enough that my knees softened under me, though not enough to convince me the danger had passed. I stood there in the dim light, clutching my lantern like a weapon and repeating the rule over and over in my head, realizing for the first time that maybe the purpose wasn't about protecting guests from scares, but protecting staff from the house itself, as if these instructions were boundaries drawn in blood long before my time. And what struck me hardest was the sound of the third toll of the hidden bell. It didn't fade the way bells are supposed to. It held in the air like a string being plucked and never released, vibrating against the windows until I swore the glass bowed inward. The radio hissed again, and for one sharp second, a woman's voice whispered, "Open," not pleading, not commanding, but inviting. And the sound was so close to Kat's voice, the girl who had helped me rehearse the rules, that my hand moved without permission, fingers brushing the cold metal of the handle, but the instant I felt its chill, I jerked back like I'd been burned, heart hammering, mouth dry, repeating Rule 1 in a desperate rhythm: don't answer, don't answer, don't answer. And when the sound finally broke off into silence, I realized I was trembling head to toe like a man who had just stepped away from the edge of a cliff. For the next hour, I didn't move from the center of the foyer, watching the shadows ripple across the paintings and counting the seconds by the uneven chew of the grandfather clock, every creak of the wood a threat, every flicker of my lantern a warning. And though the tourists had long since left, I felt more observed than I ever had in my life, as if the house itself had leaned forward to study me, measuring how tightly I clung to its rules, testing whether I would fold at the first whisper of my name. And when I finally staggered back toward the kitchen to join the others, I knew I hadn't just passed a test, I had survived an invitation. And the thing that worried me most was how badly part of me wanted to know what would have happened if I'd answered. By the time the tours ended and the guests were gone, the silence inside Hawthorn House felt heavier than before, as though the laughter and nervous screams of strangers had been food for the place, and now it was digesting in the dark, the air settling into a stillness that pressed on my lungs. I made my rounds with the lantern, my boots whispering across carpets that looked older than my grandfather, and when I stepped into the music room, I saw the mirror again, tall and crowned with gilded leaves, its glass warped and mottled, the kind of imperfection that made reflections swam like fish in shallow water. And at first it showed me what I expected: my hunched shoulders, my tired eyes, the faint glow of the lantern shaking in my grip. But then, as I adjusted the flame, the reflections shifted until I was staring at my own back, the sight so unnatural that it froze me where I stood, because every instinct screamed to spin around, to check what might be behind me. But Rule 2 drilled its warning into my skull.
If a mirror shows you from behind, do not turn around. And I clung to that line like it was scripture, forcing myself to keep still even as my throat tightened. In the warped reflection, my lantern arm rose higher than I'd lifted it, and the me in the mirror leaned closer to the frame, eyes wide and hungry in a way mine weren't. And beyond my mirrored back, something crawled across the threshold of the door, long pale fingers curling around the frame like vines searching for something to strangle. Sweat trickled down my temple, and I whispered through gritted teeth, "Not tonight." The same words I'd muttered in the foyer, as though repeating them gave me ownership over my fear. But the reflection didn't listen. Its lips moved, though mine stayed sealed, forming words I couldn't hear. And in the glass corridor behind it, the lantern's glow bloomed brighter, like the world inside the mirror was more alive than the one I was standing in. My knees wobbled, and I thought about smashing the mirror with the lantern's iron base, but some deeper instinct told me that if I broke it, whatever was moving on the other side would have a doorway straight into my world. So instead, I did the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. I walked backward, slow, careful, refusing to give the mirror my back while my lungs begged to suck in more air. Step after step, I moved toward the threshold, my calves burning from holding the crouch, the lantern heavy in my grip, and I kept my eyes locked on the glass until I crossed into the hall, where I finally dared to blink. But even then I didn't turn, not until I was 2 rooms away with a locked door between me and the mirror. In the silence that followed, the radio clipped to my belt crackled to life, static gnawing the air, and through it came a single syllable, my name, Gray, drawn out like a sigh, the exact same way it had slipped through the keyhole earlier at the front door. And for one sickening moment, I thought the voice would ask me to turn around, to break Rule 2, to give it the chance it was waiting for. But the radio cut out with a sharp pop, leaving only the thundering of my heart. I stood there in the dim corridor, counting my breaths, reminding myself that this was just my first week on the job, that I'd signed on for a paycheck, not a curse. And yet, in that moment, staring at the pattern of roses stitched into the faded wallpaper, I realized something I hadn't wanted to admit. This house wasn't just playing with me, it was teaching me, testing me, training me like some cruel teacher who already knew I'd fail if I hesitated. And the rules weren't meant to make my work easier, they were meant to keep me alive. I pressed my back to the wall, closed my eyes, and repeated each rule under my breath, tasting the words like bitter medicine. Because if I forgot even one of them, the mirror had already shown me what would happen. I wouldn't just lose the job, I'd lose myself to the version of me already waiting in the glass, the one whose smile was just a little too sharp, whose lantern burned a little too bright, and who seemed eager to take my place.
By 3:30 in the morning, the house had grown so quiet that every creak and sigh felt like a signal meant only for me, and I found myself clinging to the thought of the other staff as if they were lifelines. So I made my way to the kitchen, where the warmth of the old gas stove and the faint chatter of the Victorian orphans, 2 teenagers paid too little for the job, made the place feel almost normal. Mrs. Vale was there too, her posture stiff and her lips pressed tight around a cup of tea. And Lionel leaned against the counter with his script half folded in his pocket, smirking like a man who'd seen enough to make jokes, but never enough to laugh at them fully. We counted ourselves aloud, me, Vale, Lionel, the orphans, 5 in total, and when the number landed even, I felt the pressure in my chest ease just slightly, though Lionel caught my eye and topped the laminated rules tucked into my pocket with a teaspoon, saying, "You're still carrying those around like scripture, huh?" And I wanted to snap back, but his tone wasn't cruel, just weary, like he'd carried them once too. The radio hissed faintly, a sound so familiar by now that I almost tuned it out until the static shivered into something like a laugh. And for a moment, all of us went silent, each of us pretending not to notice while secretly waiting for the punchline that never came. I tried to swallow my nerves with the stale shortbread left on a cracked plate, but the moment the kitchen door opened, my appetite vanished. There she was, a woman I didn't recognize, wearing a staff coat as crisp as if it had come straight from the laundry, her hair pinned in a neat bun, her cheeks dusted with rouge like someone stepping out of a sepia photograph, and in her hands she carried a wicker basket lined with cloth. "For you," she said with a voice that sounded too distant, too rehearsed, like a recording that had been played 1,000 times, and she set the basket on the table with careful precision before gliding out of the room, her footsteps making no sound across the tiles. "Who was that?" I asked, but Mrs. Vale's voice came sharp and clipped. "No one." And when I lifted the napkin covering the basket, my fingers touched something cold and heavy, a small bell, hand-welded and stained dark at the mouth, as though it had been wrung through blood instead of air.
and though I wanted to throw it back into the basket, I set it on the table, unable to take my eyes off it. The orphans giggled nervously, clutching their phones as if the glow of the screens could ward off whatever had just visited us, but I couldn't shake the thought that the house was keeping count in its own way, that this bell wasn't just an object but a tally mark carved into reality. Lionel muttered under his breath that we shouldn't touch it. Mrs. Vale gave me a look that said she was testing whether I understood the rules deeply enough to know what this meant, and all the while the bell sat there, like an unblinking eye, waiting for someone to break silence and ring it. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the edges of exhaustion creep into my bones. But beneath the fatigue was a sharper dread, the kind you feel when you realize the rules don't just keep you safe, they bind you to something that's already watching, already aware. And as I stared at that little brass bell, I knew the night wasn't over, that the house hadn't finished its lesson yet, and that whatever came after would demand more of me than silence and obedience. It would demand my memory, my faith, maybe even my name.
By the time the clock dragged its hands past 4, the house had shifted again, like a stage changing sets behind a curtain, and I found myself pulled toward the nursery, as though invisible fingers were tugging me up the south turret stairs, each step groaning beneath my boots in a way that felt less like wood and more like breath being forced from lungs. The brass keyring rattled like nervous teeth against my thigh, and when I reached the nursery door, the knob was warm to the touch, as though a child's hand had just slipped away. But when I pushed it open, the air inside was cold enough to sting my throat. The wallpaper was faded with outlines of rabbits and moons, the kind of cheerful pattern meant to soothe children, but warped by years of damp and peeling. And the rocking horse in the corner shifted once, as if impatient, its single painted eye watching me with blank hunger. I lifted my lantern and saw 4 dolls lined in the crib, cloth bodies slumped together, porcelain faces cracked and hairline streaks. And though I had checked earlier and remembered only 3, there was no mistaking the 4th, smaller and newer, its tag fluttering faintly on its wrist with a name written in brown ink, Gray. And the sight of my name dangling from a doll in a crib that had been empty for decades nearly sent my legs out from under me. I backed up, my lantern shaking so hard the shadows jittered like living things across the wallpaper, and I tried to swallow the nausea crawling up my throat while telling myself this was a prank, some theatrical trick planted by Lionel or the orphans. But when I stepped closer, the smell hit me, musty, damp, threaded with rot, like something had been sewn into the doll that shouldn't be there. And the mirror across the room, oval and small, sat low on the wall at a child's height, reflecting only my boots and the hem of my coat. But even at that angle, I swore I saw the lantern's glow flicker in the glass, as though someone taller was holding it. I wanted to turn, to check behind me, but Rule 2 rang in my ears like a commandment, and so I forced my gaze away, staring instead at the window where condensation smeared the glass into a milky blur. And slowly, painfully, words began to form on the other side, traced by a finger I couldn't see. DONTLOOKBEHINDYOU. And my lungs seized, because the only thing worse than knowing something was behind me was being told so directly. But I clenched my jaw, muttering "not tonight" again like a prayer, refusing to break the rule. And with trembling hands, I slammed the window latch down as though that could stop whatever message was being written. The rocking horse gave another impatient nod, dust raining from its mane, and the doll with my name seemed to tilt its head ever so slightly, as if listening to a song I couldn't hear. And in the silence that followed, I realized the nursery wasn't just a place to hide in case the staff count went wrong. It was a holding cell, a room where the house placed the things it wanted us to see, a room meant to remind me that even if I followed every rule, my name was already stitched into its game. I staggered back out into the hall, pulling the door closed and fumbling the lock with clumsy fingers, whispering the rules under my breath like a child saying bedtime prayers. And though I tried to tell myself I'd done everything right, the truth clawed at the back of my skull. The house hadn't asked me to break the rules, it had asked me to believe in them. And that was somehow worse, because belief meant surrender. And if I kept surrendering,
There might come a night when I wouldn't just find my name on a doll, I'd find my place among them.
When the grandfather clock downstairs rasped out the slow crawl toward 5, I already felt half dead from exhaustion, nerves scraped raw. But the house wasn't finished with me, not yet, and it made that clear the moment the small bell from the basket rang on its own, where I had hidden it under a mixing bowl in the foyer, a sound damp and metallic, as if struck under water, vibrating through the tiles and into the marrow of my bones. I froze at the kitchen doorway, lantern swinging in my grip, watching as the overturned bowl skittered across the table like a kicked can, revealing the bell standing upright on its base, its mouth angled toward the great front door. Outside, the fog pressed harder against the glass panes. The knocker rose like a bronze fist waking from sleep. And when the first 3 knocks landed, each one thundered in my ribs as though my heart had answered them. But worse than the sound was the whisper that followed through the keyhole, the same voice as before, soft and intimate, drawing my name out like it had always belonged to it. Gray. Not shouted, not called, but spoken like a secret exchanged between lovers. And I hated how badly my body wanted to answer, how easily my hand drifted toward the cold metal of the handle before the memory of Rule 1 snapped me back into place. I stumbled backward, muttering, "Do not answer, over and over, as if repeating the words fast enough would keep my will from unraveling. But then the knocking changed, 2 knocks this time, a pause, then 2 again, and my blood went cold because that was the signal we used between staff in the dark, the code Kat herself had rehearsed with me in the cafe. And for one terrifying second I thought, maybe it really was her out there. Maybe she was trapped or testing me or both. But even then, even with my chest aching from the need to believe, the voice came again, Gray. And though it wore her shape, her cadence, it didn't belong to her, because there was a hunger threaded in it, a satisfaction at knowing how close I was to breaking. I clamped my jaws shut, refusing, even when the sequence changed again, this time the soft staccato rhythm of a child's knock, hesitant and polite, the kind that begged for mercy more than permission. And I swear the temperature dropped as I backed away, lantern light shrinking against the walls, the small bell in my pocket rattling against my thigh like it was trying to leap free. I ripped it out, holding it in my palm, and for the first time I saw the stain inside its mouth still wet, as though it had been dipped in something freshly spilled. And the radio clipped to my belt spat into the air, and through it came a single word, open, spoken in a tone so calm it felt inevitable, like the conclusion to a prayer. But I screamed no back at it, and to my horror, the bronze fist paused, the doorknob ceased its turning, and the bell in my hand shuddered once and went still, as if the refusal had been accepted, or maybe only postponed. The silence that followed was thicker than any scream, pressing into my ears until I could hear nothing but my pulse. And when I turned toward the staircase, I saw fog leaking from the cracks beneath the nursery door above, curling downward like smoke from a chimney. And I knew the house was shifting into its final game for the night, Rule 3 clawing at my memory. Count the staff before dawn. I staggered back to the kitchen where the others huddled, their eyes wide and faces pale, and Mrs. Vale hissed at me to count, her voice sharp enough to slice through my days. I did. Lionel, the orphans, Vale, me. 5. And the relief was instant, a sigh escaping before I realized the door had opened again, and standing there was the woman with the basket, hair pinned, rouge too bright, smile too perfect, asking, "Tea?" in the same tone as before, and though my head screamed no, my mouth stayed shut because if I denied it, it might count as speaking, and the rules hadn't prepared me for this contradiction. She placed 7 cups on the table, 1 for each of us, plus 2 extra, and I felt the numbers twist in my stomach, because though we counted even, the cups told a different story, one where someone else had joined the tally, someone unseen. The orphans cried softly, Lionel cursed under his breath, Vale stood rigid as if bolted to the floor, and I clutched the bell until my fingers bled where its loop dug into my skin, realizing that the house wasn't testing whether we could follow its rules, it was testing how much contradiction we could endure before we broke ourselves trying to reconcile them. I looked at those cups and at the basket woman fading back through the door without a sound, and I understood why the nursery was always the final refuge, because when the numbers don't match, when the rules don't hold, the house wins.
and the only choice left is to barricade yourself in the room it designates as safe, waiting for morning like a condemned man waiting for the axe. And as I stumbled toward the staircase once more, I whispered the rules until my voice cracked, not because I believed they would save me, but because I knew if I stopped repeating them, I would have no choice but to answer whatever it was that kept whispering my name through the walls of Hawthorn House.
By the time I reached the nursery stairs, the house had become a living thing around me, each door breathing mist, each wall stretching shadows thin as skin, and my lantern flickered as if reluctant to guide me higher. But I forced myself upward, clutching the brass keys in one hand and the stained bell in the other, repeating the rules under my breath like a mantra. Don't answer the door, don't turn at the mirror, count the staff before dawn. And yet with every step I took, I knew the house was arranging its own count, a tally I could not see but could feel pressing in from the dark. When I pushed into the nursery, the air was suffocating, heavy with the musk of damp toys and rotted fabric. And though I had bolted the door earlier, it now stood ajar, rocking gently as if someone had been waiting for me. And inside the crib, the dolls were no longer 4, but 5, each bearing tags with names written in brown ink: Lionel, Vale, Orphan, Orphan, and Gray, the handwriting jagged and fresh as those scrawled seconds before my arrival. And though my instinct was to sweep them to the floor, I couldn't bring myself to touch them, afraid they might feel warm, alive. The rocking horse ticked back and forth like a pendulum, the mirror at child's height had fogged over, and within its clouded glass, shapes moved with a logic my mind refused to name, as though the reflection belonged to another nursery in another version of the house where something had already claimed us. I slammed the bolt, dragged a dresser in front of the door, and sat with my back to the crib, the doll's stares digging holes into the back of my skull. And all the while, the bell in my hand rattled like a heart with no body, begging to be rung. Then came the sound that broke me, the sequence of knocks from the foyer below. 3, pause, 2, pause, 3 again, climbing through the floorboards like coded messages in bone, and the voice calling my name, first in the cadence of Lionel, then in Vale's brittle tone, then in Cot's sweet lilt, all layered until they became one voice that didn't belong to any of them but wanted me to believe it did. I pressed the bell against my chest to keep my heart from bursting, whispering no, no, no. But the dolls seemed to lean forward in the crib, tags fluttering as though stirred by invisible breath, and I realized with a surge of cold clarity that the rules had never been about winning. They were about delaying, stretching survival from one night into the next, teaching us that obedience was the only way to last, not to escape. The mirror cleared for a moment, and in its warped reflection, I saw myself not seated on the floor, but standing at the nursery window with the bell to my lips, ready to ring it. And the horror wasn't that the reflection was wrong, it was that it felt like a prophecy I couldn't resist. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressed my spine harder into the door, and told myself if I could endure this one night, just this one, the morning would come and the house would release me. But in the silence between knocks, I heard a whisper inside the room, behind the dolls, behind the mirror, a child's voice thin as cobwebs, asking softly, "Are you ready to be counted?" And though I didn't answer, the way the rocking horse creaked faster told me the house already had its tally, and that my name wasn't on a tag for nothing. The knocks finally died away, like a storm pulling back over black water, but the silence that followed was worse, because silence in Hawthorn House is never absence, it is presence holding its breath. And I sat there in the nursery, lantern dimming, staring at the dolls in the crib until my eyes blurred, each of their stitched mouths curled into faint smiles that hadn't been there before, as though they'd grown amused at my restraint. I told myself I needed to move, to finish the round, to lock the doors, so I dragged myself up, every bone aching from crouching against the dresser, and slipped back into the hall where the air reeked of fog and something sharper, like copper left too long in the rain. And as I moved door to door, turning keys and locks with trembling hands, I could feel the house pressing closer, its bones groaning in satisfaction each time I obeyed. When I reached the music room, the mirror loomed like an old enemy, glass perfectly still and yet humming faintly, as though holding in laughter, and though Rule 2 clanged in my skull, warning me not to look if it betrayed me again,
I felt it pulling my gaze anyway, daring me, and so I forced my focus to the latch of the window, clamping it shut with fingers that shook so badly I nearly dropped the keyring. The radio on my belt burst with static, then words. 3 of them, clear as day. Count them now. And my stomach dropped because it wasn't dawn yet, wasn't time for Rule 3, but the voice insisted, repeating the phrase in different cadences, sometimes cats, sometimes veils, sometimes a child's, until it blurred into something not human at all. And when I shouted back, "No!" the static ceased and the chandelier above me flickered so violently it rained dust and shards of glass onto the carpet. I bolted through the corridor, locking doors at a fevered pace, heart galloping, and every time I glanced back I swore the shadows grew taller, stretching along the walls like limbs reaching for me. Finally I reached the staircase, lungs burning, and looked up toward the nursery where fog still leaked from beneath the door in slow curls. And though every instinct screamed to run outside, to tear open the front door and let the night devour me, Rule 1 anchored me in place, reminding me that opening it was death wearing a polite smile. So instead I staggered upward, whispering each rule under my breath like rosary beads, "Don't answer, don't turn, count." And as I reached the top landing, I felt steps echoing mine half a beat late, something unseen walking in rhythm with me. And though I refused to turn, every nerve in my spine burned with the certainty that if I broke and looked, the house would finally know me, not as a guest, not as staff, but as its own.
Inside the nursery, the air was thicker than ever, so heavy it felt like I was walking into lungs that had been holding their breath all night. And the moment I bolted the door behind me, the rocking horse began its creak again, slow and steady like a pendulum marking the seconds until dawn. Except it wasn't dawn yet. The windows still drowned in fog that pressed against the glass like pale hands. And when I turned toward the crib, I froze because there were now 6 dolls waiting, their porcelain faces gleaming faintly in the lantern light, each tagged with a name in the same jagged brown ink: Vale, Lionel, Orphan, Gray, and one new, unreadable, the letter smeared as though the ink hadn't dried, and I knew in my gut it was meant to be filled the moment I broke one of the rules. I pressed my back against the wall and tried to breathe evenly, clutching the stained bell so tightly it left a circle imprinted in my palm. But the house was counting louder than my breath, louder than my heartbeat, and I felt the tally of every mistake weighing down the rafters. Then came the sound from below, not knocks this time, but footsteps, dozens of them, marching in a rhythm that didn't belong to any of us, as though a phantom staff had arrived to swell the numbers. And the radio on my belt sputtered alive, voices layered one atop another, whispering, "Count, count, count," until my knees shook and my lips obeyed, murmuring names into the stale air as if that would keep me alive. When I whispered "Gray," the dolls shifted, all their heads tilting toward me at once with the faint crack of porcelain joints, and my throat locked tight, because it felt like I had just given permission for the house to write my name a second time. The mirror across the room clouded, then cleared to show the same nursery but empty of me, the crib holding only 1 doll with my tag, and the rocking horse moving without rider. And I understood with sickening clarity that the house wasn't showing me a trick, it was showing me the ending it wanted, the version of the room that would exist if I failed. I staggered to the window, desperate for any sign of light, and for a moment the fog thinned, revealing the faintest streak of gold on the horizon. But before I could breathe relief, the condensation spelled new words across the glass, written from outside by an invisible finger. "You are ready to be counted." And with that, the bell in my hand rang once on its own, muffled but final. And all 6 dolls in the crib smiled as though the house had just finished its tally.
Dawn should have felt like salvation, but in Hawthorn House, light doesn't break, it seeps, trickling through the fog-stained windows in faint threads that barely touch the floor. And when the grandfather clock below groaned its 6 chimes, I unbolted the nursery door with hands that felt more bone than flesh. Every motion slow, deliberate, terrified that if I moved too quickly, the dolls would follow. Stepping into the corridor was like walking out of a fever, everything sharp, too bright, every sound magnified, and the stairs stretched before me, like a descent into something deeper, not out of it, each step echoing as though hundreds of unseen feet walked in rhythm behind me, the house counting me down to the foyer. When I reached the bottom, the chandelier still swayed gently, though there was no draft, and beneath it stood Mrs. Vale, Lionel, and the orphans, pale and silent, their eyes tracking me as if waiting for me to speak first. But I didn't dare, because the rules were pounding in my head like church bells. Don't answer the door, don't turn at the mirror, count before dawn. And though I whispered the tally under my breath, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, it came out wrong, because something about the way they stood, stiff and symmetrical, made me certain the numbers weren't ours anymore, that we'd been replaced by placeholders in the house's endless ledger. The radio on my belt gave a sharp hiss, then the basket woman's voice murmured, "Tea?" as if she were right behind me, and though I didn't turn, I knew if I did, I'd see her standing there with her neat hair and rouge smile, waiting to hand me another cup to fill the empty place at the table. I pushed past the silence, past the rows of eyes and into the foyer, where the bronze fist of the front door was raised halfway, frozen as though interrupted, and for the first time I wondered what would happen if I ignored the rules completely, if I flung the door wide and walked into the fog. But before my hand could even twitch toward the handle, the small bell in my pocket rang once, sharp and commanding, and every shadow in the house leaned toward me at once, reminding me that obedience wasn't just survival, it was belonging. I stumbled back, clutching the bell, and Vale's voice, thin and cracking, whispered, "Some nights we keep the house, some nights the house keeps us." And I realized she wasn't warning me, she was confessing, admitting that the staff weren't employees at all, but entries in the house's count, placeholders that lasted only as long as they clung to the rules. The fog at the windows began to thin, golden light slicing through in crooked bars, and the bronze fist slowly lowered, retreating as though dawn itself had dismissed it. And though relief should have filled me, it didn't, because when I glanced back at the staircase, I saw the dolls lie neatly on the bottom step, 6 of them, each tag dangling, Vale, Lionel, Orphan, Orphan, Gray, and the smeared one finally legible spelling out a new name I didn't recognize, a future placeholder already chosen. I wanted to run, to tear free of the house's grip, but my feet carried me to the table instead, where the contract I had signed my first day lay neatly folded, waiting for my hand, and beside it sat my laminated rules card, damp now, the ink bleeding, but still legible enough to remind me that I had followed each line, survived each test, and still I had been counted. I pressed the bell onto the table and whispered to no one. I kept the rules. But the chandelier above flickered once, twice, and I knew that wasn't enough. Because in Hawthorn House, survival isn't victory, it's recruitment, and every night you live only binds you deeper into its tally. When I finally stumbled outside into the weak daylight, lungs dragging in cold air like it was freedom, the house loomed behind me, its windows dull and watchful, and though the fog was thinning, I swore I heard the faint creak of the rocking horse from the nursery carried on the wind, reminding me that my name was already stitched into a doll, waiting for the night I slipped, waiting for the night I stopped believing the rules were enough to save me. And as I walked down the ridge, clutching the edges of my coat, I knew with a bone-deep certainty that I hadn't escaped anything at all. I had only been spared until the next count, and one day, when the numbers turned odd, the house would finally balance its books with me.
And that was my first week inside Hawthorn House. The rules were simple, but survival never is. I followed them, I obeyed them, and still, the house haunted me. Maybe next time, it won't let me walk away. If you enjoyed tonight's story, don't forget to subscribe to Echoes After Midnight for more terrifying tales. Because out here, the night never ends. It only waits for the next victim.